The defense tried to pin it on her husband, a man whom even his kids called a mean drunk. They said you just can't go around collecting DNA from people without their knowledge and tying them to crimes. So, should a truck parked in a public space be a free-for-all for the FBI? This is the story of Betty Rolf, the Wisconsin mom who was murdered on her morning walk to work. Hi friends, I'm Katie, and this is Katie Does Crime. Thank you for joining me for the first time if you're new here, and hello to the usual rapscallions and reprobates. Please consider subscribing or joining me on Patreon if you'd like to hear more true crime stories. Today's case is my 100th YouTube video, and I wondered if I should do something special, like a thank you video for all of you amazing people who have been so supportive of me, a little old nobody in the true crime world. Or maybe a Q&A in case you have any burning questions for me. Or I thought I could read some of the mean comments I've gotten, like the person who told me I have neither the face nor the fashion sense for YouTube. But I'm just going to do one of my favorite things, talk about a cold case that got solved years and years later. It started on the morning of November 7th, 1988, when Betty Clayball Rolf's body was found under a railroad bridge in the town of Appleton, Wisconsin. Her daughter had reported her missing, and a police officer had located her after only 20 minutes of searching. She was face down in loose gravel and wedged against a cement wall. Her family thought at first that it could have been a hit-and-run accident, that someone had hidden Betty to cover up the crime. But it was too suspicious that she was found with her shoes, pants, and underwear removed and placed nearby. The coroner quickly determined that Betty was murdered by asphyxiation. The 60-year-old had been walking to work the day before, which was just blocks from her home. She was known for walking everywhere and not being afraid of anyone. Her husband called her an old farm girl that way. But she never got to punch her time card at work that day. Betty was born in Port William, Ohio, just northeast of Cincinnati. That's where she met her husband, Charles, who was stationed at a nearby Air Force base. They married and moved to Wisconsin, where he was a security guard and she cleaned at a banquet hall called the Country Air. In their 35 years together, they had 5 children and 10 grandchildren. Betty loved Christmas and listening to the local minor league baseball games from her yard. Her homemade bread and pie were the delight of the neighborhood. People said Betty was caring and had no enemies. One niece called her the best person I ever knew, and Betty's sister said Charles was going to be lost without her. Betty's daughter said she was a beautiful woman. She didn't drink or smoke or go out to bars or anything like that, which is such a 1988 thing to say. I love it. Police weren't sure what to think, what with Betty being a well-liked person with what the Post-Crescent newspaper called only a modest income, the idea being that the murder probably wasn't over money. One neighbor said that although some people looked down on her for having a run-down house, they loved that Betty was cheerful and friendly and always had something cute to say. Charles had last seen his wife at 11 p.m. on Saturday when he got home from work. They watched TV, not knowing it was their last moment together. The authorities asked for help from anyone who might have seen anything along West Spencer Street around 6 a.m. on Sunday. Now, Betty had actually been murder-adjacent a few years before, in 1982. That year, a 25-year-old woman had been shot by her ex-boyfriend as she sat in a car with her brother. The brother had tried to drive her to the hospital, but was so stricken by his grief that he stopped the car at his friend's home. That friend was Betty's son. Betty helped the man call the police. But they didn't think that murder had anything to do with this one. All they knew was that Betty had been carrying $30 in cash in her purse that hadn't been stolen, and that evidence was going to be very hard to come by. The area had been covered by a snowstorm on the morning Betty was killed, which, as I'm sure you know, hides so much and erases even more. Things were so unclear that the news reports at the time were conflicted about whether she had even been assaulted or not. Reports immediately said that she had been, but investigators thought there was a chance that Betty had been left partially nude to mislead them. They canvassed the area, interviewing more than 100 people by day 10, but the leads just weren't coming. A $500 reward was offered. By December, Betty's husband Charles had taken a polygraph test against the wishes of his children, who said he had nothing to prove. But when the results came back inconclusive, the local police wanted him to go to Milwaukee for another one. Charles refused, but he said it was only because he didn't have anything to do with the murder. He said, "I didn't have nothing to hide. There's an easier way to get rid of a spouse than that. You just get a divorce." He said he and Betty had been happily married, and in fact, their marriage had only improved in the past 10 years. He said his old lady didn't mind if he stopped by the bar after work for a couple of beers. But he worried some transient had come across Betty that morning and was probably in Timbuktu by now. One good thing for Charles, something that made him look more innocent, is that there was no life insurance for him to collect on Betty. He said, "If I'd had a big insurance policy, I'd be in jail. They couldn't find no motive. Thank God for little favors." The following February, police revealed that Betty had blunt force trauma to her head and had endured an assault before her death. But they said that the fact was her murder had occurred on one of the worst winter mornings the town had seen. The search for evidence was complicated, and the dead ends just kept coming. A year later, the case was still unsolved. But a big tip had come in recently from someone who said he'd seen 3 men in the area on the morning of Betty's death, and it seemed like a promising lead. The person said something had just clicked in his brain on the anniversary of the murder. He had seen one of the 3 men headed directly toward the scene of the crime at the right time. But when the police interviewed the men, it turns out that they had been there on a different day. A detective said the dates were actually way off. Another dead end. Betty's son said that he had given up hope that they would ever know what happened. And I don't know what Charles was thinking, but he had moved in with a widow friend and told the Post-Crescent, "I'm over it pretty much now, you know. Time heals all wounds." And I'm like, Charles, it had been 1 year. Have some decency. The local newspaper continued to report on Betty's case throughout the 90s and early 2000s, mostly to mention how frustrating the case was to the authorities. But it turns out that, unbeknownst to anyone, advances in genetic testing had given officers a reason to send some trace DNA evidence from the crime scene to a California lab in 1997. The test didn't come back with great news, but at least there was some news. Betty's husband, Charles, and another unnamed suspect had nothing to do with the crime. A sheriff's department investigator called it bittersweet, the way they had gotten an answer but eliminated their 2 main suspects in the process. They sent the DNA profile to a national database and hoped for a hit someday, believing there was no way this guy had just stopped committing crimes. The Post-Crescent called Betty's case unsolved but not cold. The area newspapers continued publishing stories to keep her fresh in the minds of their readers, and the sheriff's department continued to assign new investigators to look at the evidence with new eyes, even into the 2010s. And then suddenly, out of nowhere in December 2022, there was a breakthrough. Even though I knew this case was solved going into it, after scrolling through 100 articles about no leads and bad evidence, I got chills when I read the headline, "Man charged in 34-year-old murder." I'm getting chills right now just talking about it. As is usually the case lately, it was genetic genealogy that finally brought him to justice. Apparently, investigators had started their search as far back as 2019, and they eventually discovered that the DNA profile they had on hand only matched one man or his brother. The brother said he thought the other was dead and gave his DNA to prove he was innocent. His sample ruled him out, so the FBI was now on the hunt to see if the other man was still alive. And unfortunately for him, he was.
More than 34 years, a major break in an Outagamie County cold case involving a woman who was assaulted, then left for dead. The family of 60-year-old Betty Rolf finally has answers tonight with the arrest of a suspect in Washington state connected to the crime through advanced DNA testing.
Jean Clarence Meyer was now 66 years old and had lived about a mile from Betty Rolf in 1988. He worked at a local canning factory there for a time. After the murder, he moved to Washington state. Jean's niece said he once called her mother after Betty's death and said, "Goodbye and thank you for everything." Her mother later said that she had a secret from that phone call, but that she would take it to her grave. And I guess she did. Meyer had some light contact with police in Wisconsin and Washington over things like driving while intoxicated, but it must have not ever been enough to get him into the FBI's DNA database. It was there in Eatonville, Washington, that the FBI found Meyer living on someone else's land in a trailer with no running water and no electricity. They took a DNA sample from the door handle of his truck and confirmed the match to the sample left on Betty's body. Meyer was charged with first-degree murder and first-degree assault with a weapon. Betty's daughter had been so worried that the killer was someone they knew. She said she felt a relief knowing she didn't have to look over her shoulders anymore.
After learning of Meyer's arrest, the family went to the scene of the crime, placing a cross on the bridge above where Rolf's body was found.
She was a beautiful lady, good cook, great artist. She was a mom. She was a beautiful soul.
And the sweetest person you could ever imagine. She had a heart of gold.
After 34 years, the family is also grateful investigators never gave up on solving this case.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I mean, we kept her memory alive, and we'll keep her memory alive forever.
Meyer was held on $2 million bail and argued that the DNA evidence from his truck should be thrown out. His lawyers claimed that his Fourth Amendment rights against unreasonable search and seizure were violated because there was no warrant to swab his door handle. Prosecutors argued that when your truck is parked in public, there's no expectation of privacy. A judge agreed, and Meyer went to trial in May 2024. At trial, the Outagamie County DA revealed that Meyer had strangled Betty with her own purse straps. When she was found under the bridge, next to her body was an announcement she had been planning to send to the Post-Crescent newspaper about her wedding anniversary with Charles. The deputy DA said the likelihood of the DNA found on Betty and her gloves not matching Meyer was 25 octillion to 1. Meyer's defense attorney said that Charles had been abusive and unfaithful to Betty throughout their marriage and that everyone knew it. Betty's children did testify that he was a mean drunk and that although they never saw him hit her, they did see the injuries on her face later. A friend of Betty's testified that she was planning to leave Charles. Charles had died in 1999 and wasn't there to defend himself. The defense said the only thing the DNA proved was that Meyer and Betty had sexual contact in the weeks leading up to her murder, and hey, it could have totally been consensual. Gross. The deputy DA said it's unlikely Betty would have chosen a homeless guy the same age as her son. And on the way to work, under a bridge? The defense said the DA was trying to play on existing stereotypes of unhoused people, and they said that if Meyer was homeless, there's no way he would have left that $30 from Betty's purse behind. But the jury didn't buy it. It only took them 3 hours to deliberate. On May 21st, 2024, Jean Meyer was found guilty of first-degree murder and first-degree assault and will face a mandatory sentence of life in prison in July 2024. However, a judge gets to decide if he can ever seek parole. 12,972 days after her murder, Betty Rolf got justice. We may never know what the motive behind the murder was for a 32-year-old transient, but it seems like Jean Meyer will have plenty of time to think about it in prison. So what's your feeling about the door handle swab? Meyer's defense admits that his truck was parked in public when his DNA sample was taken from it, but they say there's an invitation to view a vehicle in public but not touch it. Do you agree? As always, please let me know what you think about this case in the comments. Thank you for tuning in today. I'm just a true crime fan like you are, and I really appreciate you taking a chance on me. Please like and subscribe to my channel if you like spending this time together. I would be so appreciative. Until next time, I'm Katie, and this has been Katie Does Crime.